How about we start with Jerell Square? Could you tell us about that project and what it means for New York as you see it?
Sure. So Jerell Square is a really interesting project. So it's three iconic towers. It'll total a little over 2,000 units, parking and retail, and it's located substantially outside of the Manhattan core. And so I think
Whereabouts exactly?
So it's in Jerell Square, which is outside of Jersey City, New Jersey, connected to the PATH station, which is part of the story. And so I think the projects like that are popping up and down the PATH terminal, PATH stations now, as the robustness of the New York metropolitan economy continues to grow. I read a really interesting statistic in that the population of the New York metropolitan area between 2010 and 2014 grew by 553,000 people in that 4-year period. And so with the health and vigor of an economy like that, you start to see development substantially out of the core, which is what we're seeing in places like Jerell Square.
Yeah, give us a little context of Jersey City, across the Hudson, obviously. It's always had kind of an urban experience, and it's always been sort of part of greater New York, and I think it's been referred to as like another borough, and somewhat facetiously sometimes maybe, but always been part of this economy and this culture. But now, do you think it's a substantially different moment, that it's really becoming more of its own draw, or is it just development expanding out to its logical extreme? I mean, what do you see as the significance of this?
Sure, and I think we're seeing all of the related economies that are part of this cluster of the New York conurbation really be incredibly healthy at this moment in time. So Hoboken, Jersey City, and other areas in the region are seeing rapid growth. They are still tethered, to the health and vigor of the New York economy. And a lot of what's going on in Jersey City and Jerell Square is really tethered to the financial district. And the PATH infrastructure is incredible. You can get from Jersey City and Jerell Square from anywhere between 7 and 15 minutes into the new PATH terminal at the World Trade Center, which is a half to a third of what it might take you to get from Upper Manhattan, from Williamsburg, from other parts of Manhattan, Brooklyn, or the outer boroughs. And so and you can live there for a discount that would be anywhere from 30 to 50% in terms of the rent that you might pay in amazing new buildings. So it's pretty compelling. And so people who are starting out their careers are very attracted to that. And so that, so there are, and they're being overlaid onto places that already have their own richness and history. So Hoboken is a real place. Jersey City is a real place, and they're dealing with this influx of people who may not really understand what New Jersey or Hoboken or Jersey City is all about.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting.
No, that's very interesting, and I don't know if this is too in the weeds for our global audience, but I mean, like, New Jersey and New York have a very long, sort of, in some ways, fraught relationship, and I wonder, as you suggested, you've got people moving into Hoboken, increasingly able to move to Jersey City and spend most of their time working in Manhattan. That's nothing new, but what's that going to do to the culture of these places, both New York and New Jersey, to have this increasingly fluid? Or does it not really matter? Is that an artificial distinction?
I think it's a little bit of an artificial distinction. I think with the new populations coming into these places, I think they, once they're there, they appreciate the local economy, and they basically support local retail, entertainment, the arts, and actually increase the tax base, which actually gives those municipalities a great opportunity to sort of leverage that moment in time. So I remember going to university at up at Cornell, in Ithaca, and I remember some of the folks who landed in our studio were from India and Pakistan, and they thought they were coming to New York City. And they found themselves in Ithaca, of all places. And it took them a little while to settle in, but they actually became fully immersed in the culture of the place. So I think if there is a culture, to the place, people will discover it, will find it, and will take it, in as part of their home. And I think that's the opportunity that we have both in Jersey City, Hoboken, and other places.
I went to Cornell as well, and I had a similar experience with some people not realizing how far from New York it was.
Right.
Which is surprising because all you have to do is look at a map.
But people are, it's New York,
Yeah,
and so
New York,
and it's a long way from Ahmedabad.
So what are some ways that market rate and affordable housing can be incorporated together in a meaningful sense? And of course, this is all coming with the context of the Poor Door scandal, having happened.
So it's really interesting because almost all affordable housing in this country is built with some sort of subsidy. And so those subsidies take a lot of different forms. They can either be direct grants of land, discounted land, zoning bonuses, tax incentives, direct subsidies to either tenants or landlords, or access to low-income finance, other mechanisms, or some elaborate combination of many of those. And so since government holds the purse strings, it's really up to, it's really, the imperative is really to find public policies that basically can most leverage those incentives. And so it's really not, in my mind, a private sector problem, it's a public sector problem in terms of really aligning those incentives with results.
From the private sector, what are some public policies that would encourage affordable housing development?
Well, there's a difference between potentially in encouraging public housing development and fully integrated public housing development. So there actually exists a really good program for fully integrating affordable housing with market rate housing, and it's called the 80/20 program. And so that basically allows developers to have access into tax-exempt finance in order to build their projects. And it's phenomenally successful in doing exactly what you suggested in terms of fully integrating those affordable units with their market rate units. And then basically that's established by law. There's things that you have to do, and that program works really well.
Although it doesn't apply to condo buildings, right?
Well, because they're not availing themselves of those incentives. So it's really when so that if a condo owner chooses not to avail themselves of those incentives, then they have no obligation. So if they're not taking anything, it's hard to impose that obligation upon them.
That's duly noted, right? I mean, if they're not getting any sort of public subsidy in a way, then why should they be subject to a public requirement? But do you think, given what many people are calling an affordability crisis is arising in New York and plenty of other cities, that there should be some public requirement for condo buildings or even any other building that wouldn't be taking a direct subsidy to still provide some sort of affordable housing?
I think no matter how you look at it, it will be the provision of a subsidy. That basically it's either a subsidy or a tax. And I think both are possible. It's really just about what kind of legislative frame you want to create to encourage that. I'm not sure that it really should be solely the job of the private sector to really house and shelter society's poorest and most vulnerable. I'm not, that used to be considered the role of government.
Do you feel like that role has sort of, that gulf between the public and private roles has gotten wider? Or I see a lot of sort of sniping back and forth, generally speaking, from, it's the public sector's job to do this, or it's the private sector isn't doing enough. And I think that there's good points to be made on either side. Do you think that there's some way for government and private sector to collaborate on this issue that hasn't been thought of before?
Well, I think they are. And I think when you have it's easier when you have a healthy economy. Because I think it's easier to really create the incentives and the taxes that basically would result in better public policy outcomes. And so I think it's important that we leverage the moment that we have now, which is a healthy economy, to try to deal with these problems. I'm not sure the existing mechanisms are sufficient.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we do certainly have a healthy economy right now, but there's been plenty of evidence it's not very healthy for most people. It's healthy in some ways in which it was different than when it was healthy in the 1950s, the concentration of wealth and all that, and the wage stagnation. So I don't know if that changes things.
I'm not sure that it should. I think one of the things that I think is interesting, if you look at the New York City Housing Authority, and if you look at the tens of thousands of units of low-income and moderate-income housing that they created, now they're basically looking at $1 billion shortfall in their capital budget, which is mostly created by the withdrawal of federal funds. And so that's a clear case of abandonment by government of its most vulnerable citizens.
Does that create a market opportunity?
It can. I'm not sure that's the best and most altruistic way to solve this very serious problem.
Yeah. The theme of this conference is global exchange of capital, essentially. How is that influencing your job today? How is it changing New York? How is it changing the world's big cities?
Sure. I think global capital has become relentlessly efficient at finding opportunities where they can have productive investments, and you're seeing that play out all around the world. We're seeing it here in New York with money coming in from many different regions, some just to chase investment, some as flight capital. You see these situations playing out in economies across the globe. And I think those global capital flows are both a potential problem and a potential opportunity for the municipalities and local governments and states that are at the receiving end of those capital flows. I think the most important thing is to have a clear and transparent regulatory frame for the receipt of those monies. And basically, developers want certainty, and if they know what the rules are, they can either go or not go. If the money comes in and there is no rules, it's really hard to guarantee outcomes. But if all of those rules and regulations are clear, transparent, open, defined, and enforced, I think then the private sector and the public sector can work together to create mutually beneficial outcomes. If those are not in place, the outcomes will be much less certain.
It's easy to see in the broad standpoint how this is impacting developers, but how is it impacting the work of architects and changing the design and the experience of our cities?
Well, I think it's interesting in our own practice. Our clients are becoming more complicated. We'll be working with a local developer and an offshore capital fund, so sometimes several. And so it actually gives us more opportunities to meet and greet folks, and who we will tend to meet in various places around the world.
That also means you have more people to convince, to do option A instead of option B.
That scrum in terms of when you're working on large projects, it's very rarely a single person making a decision about the application of hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of investment. There's always a group to convince, so it's just part of the job. And so being introduced to other people from different parts of the world just makes it a little bit more interesting.
Working with so many different offshore funds or people from, maybe you don't even necessarily know exactly the nature of where some of the money is coming from on a certain project, I wonder, is that difficult to know who your audience is, sort of, who you're dealing with?
Usually, like people like to hear architects present. So usually you'll get, if people care, you'll get invited and you'll get to, to explain why you're doing what you're doing. And it's interesting. It's really, sometimes it leads to just that sort of cultural exchange that we're talking about here.